The wind carried dust across the frontier town of Dry Creek as the noon stage pulled in. Emmett Sloan stood near the station, hands fidgeting, heart pounding. For months he had written letters, painted in words, a dream of companionship, a gentle bride to soothe the loneliness of ranch life. The wagon door creaked open, and then she stepped down. Willa Blaine, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, hands that looked more suited to roping cattle than stitching quilts. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Neighbors whispered, some snickering outright. "That woman will eat him alive," someone muttered. And in that instant, Emmett felt the sharp sting of humiliation. His dream of delicate softness shattered before half the town. He had imagined a slight figure, perhaps with a timid smile, stepping shyly into his care. Instead, Willa's presence filled the platform like a thundercloud, impossible to ignore, unmovable, undeniable. Her traveling coat hung broad across her frame, and when she shifted her trunk with one hand, the iron handle groaned as though it had met its match. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had brokered this arrangement, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, here she is, Sloan." "Miss Blaine, from Montana." His voice betrayed his unease, as though even he hadn't expected this towering woman to emerge from the stage. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with wonder, while men exchanged knowing glances that carried both ridicule and discomfort. A mismatched pair, they all thought. The small-framed, quiet rancher and the woman who looked as if she could outwork half the valley's hired hands. Emmett forced a smile, though his chest felt tight. "Miss Blaine," he stammered, tipping his hat. His voice cracked, betraying the storm inside him. But Willa did not shrink, did not waver beneath the collective gaze. Her eyes, steady and unflinching, swept over the crowd, then settled on Emmett. She nodded once. "Mr. Sloan." Her voice was low and even, not harsh but grounded, like a stone resting firm in the riverbed. The whispers did not stop. "She'll break him before winter." Poor fool didn't know what he was signing up for. Yet beneath the murmur of gossip, something else stirred, a flicker of curiosity. Willa Blaine was not the bride Emmett had dreamed of. She was something the town itself hadn't expected. And though his heart quaked with embarrassment, fate had just set into motion a story no whisper could contain. Fletcher Knox's arrangement and embarrassed introductions. Fletcher Knox, the town's merchant and self-appointed matchmaker, stood stiffly beside Emmett, his collar already damp with sweat. He was the man who had arranged this union, shuffling letters between Dry Creek and Montana, negotiating terms like he might with a shipment of flour or a wagon load of nails. But as Willa Blaine loomed before them, Fletcher's face betrayed the unease of a man whose careful dealings had delivered something unexpected. "Well, Sloan," Fletcher said, trying to keep his tone light, "this here's your bride. Miss Blaine, fine lady of ranch stock." The words stumbled out awkwardly, as if he himself couldn't quite decide if fine fit the moment. Emmett tipped his hat again, his voice caught somewhere between courtesy and panic. "Welcome, Miss Blaine. I'm glad you made the journey safe." But the words sounded thin, swallowed by the murmurs of the crowd. A few boys chuckled from the edge of the platform until their mother's stern glare silenced them. Willa, unbothered, studied Emmett with calm, measuring eyes. Her grip tightened briefly on the handle of her trunk before she lifted it single-handedly and set it down beside her feet. The iron squeaked in protest. "Your ranch?" she asked simply. "Is it far?" Emmett opened his mouth to answer, but Fletcher jumped in first, his voice too loud, as though trying to regain control of the spectacle. "Not far at all, just a short ride south. Modest place, but kept tidy. Sloan here's a hard-working man." The phrasing, modest, landed like a small knife in Emmett's pride. The crowd seized it, turning whispers into small smirks. Modest house, modest ranch, modest man, and now this towering bride. Emmett's ears burned. Every chuckle pressed against his ribs like stones in a sack. He wanted to vanish into the dust, to hide his shame. But Willa's voice broke through, calm and steady. "I like tidy," she said. Her gaze flicked past Fletcher to the wagon, to the open road stretching south toward the homestead she had yet to see. Order and care matter more than size. The crowd quieted just a little. Some exchanged surprised looks. Fletcher's rehearsed smile faltered, his attempt at smoothing things over stolen from him by the very bride he had delivered. And Emmett, though still shaken, felt a flicker, just the faintest spark, that maybe this woman who shocked the town was not here to shame him, but to test him. Willa's first walk around the ranch. The wagon rolled southward, creaking over ruts and stones, carrying Emmett Sloan and his unexpected bride. The chatter of Dry Creek faded behind them, though the weight of whispers still clung to Emmett's chest. He kept his eyes on the reins, afraid to glance at Willa for too long, as though her mere presence reminded him of every expectation that had just collapsed. When they reached the ranch, Emmett's shoulders hunched slightly, bracing for the moment she would see it. His home was no grand spread, just a modest clapboard house, a weathered barn, and a stretch of pasture that looked larger in his dreams than in the fading light of day. To Emmett, it was everything he could manage. To Willa, he feared it might look like nothing at all. But Willa did not frown. She did not sigh or shake her head. She stepped down from the wagon, boots crunching over gravel, and began to walk slowly through the yard. Her eyes moved deliberately, not with judgment, but with assessment. She stopped at the woodpile stacked neatly against the wall of the house, running her hand across the cut edges. "These are split clean," she said, more to herself than to him. "Straight lines. Careful work." She moved on, bending to examine the vegetable patch, where rows of beans and squash pushed through the soil. "This garden's been tended with patience," she murmured. "Not many men bother." Emmett blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. No one in town had ever praised his careful ways, his habit of stacking wood just so, of checking each fence post twice, of coaxing vegetables from hard ground. To most, those were signs of timidity, not strength. But Willa's voice carried no mockery, only recognition. Inside the barn, she paused again, running her hand over the smooth handles of his tools, polished from use. She smiled faintly. A man who cares for his tools will care for his home. That matters more than fine curtains or wide porches. Emmett felt heat rise in his face, not from shame, but from a quiet pride he had almost forgotten he possessed. For the first time since she stepped off that stage, he saw not a towering figure that mocked his smallness, but a woman who noticed what others dismissed. Where the town saw inadequacy, Willa Blaine saw order, care, and quiet strength. And though he could not yet say it aloud, a flicker of something new stirred within him. Perhaps this woman was not the undoing of his dream, but the reshaping of it. The bull breaks loose and sparks crisis. The next morning dawned with a restless stillness, the kind that hangs before trouble breaks. Emmett rose early, his nerves still unsettled from the day before. He busied himself repairing tack in the barn while Willa walked the yard, quietly taking in the rhythms of her new home. The prairie sun had just begun to spill gold across the horizon when a sound tore through the morning, a bellow deep and thunderous, followed by the crash of splintering wood. Emmett's stomach sank. Dakota. The bull had broken free. Nearly 2,000 pounds of muscle and rage barreled through the gap in the fence, charging into Mrs. Henderson's garden. Tomatoes, beans, and squash vanished beneath hooves the size of iron skillets. Dogs barked furiously, neighbors shouted, and in moments, the yard erupted into chaos. Men came running with ropes and sticks, but Dakota met each attempt with wild fury. He lowered his head, horns slicing the air, sending one man tumbling into the dust. Another barely scrambled away before being trampled. Emmett froze, every nerve torn between rushing in and holding back. His hands trembled at his sides, useless. He knew Dakota's strength, knew the bull could kill a man before he drew breath to cry out. And then from the corner of his eye, he saw her. Willa. She strode forward, unhurried, unarmed. No rope, no whip, no rifle, just her steady frame cutting through the panic. "Miss Blaine," Emmett called, his voice cracking. "Stay back." But she didn't. Her voice, low and calm, cut through the noise like a steady drumbeat. She spoke to the bull in tones Emmett had never heard, a rhythm both soothing and firm, like water running over stone. Dakota slowed. His wild eyes flicked toward her. His breathing shifted from furious snorts to something slower, measured. Step by step, she closed the distance, her hand outstretched but never forcing contact, and then with a quiet certainty she placed her palm against his heaving flank. The great bull shuddered and stilled. The crowd hushed, mouths agape. Even Mrs. Henderson, her ruined garden smoking with trampled stalks, stood frozen in disbelief. Willa glanced at the broken fence post. "Rotten wood," she said simply, her voice steady. "Needs replacing." And in that moment, Dry Creek saw strength in a way it never had before. Not in muscle, not in dominance, but in calm authority, born of respect. Willa's calm authority over Dakota. The air hung heavy with silence, as if even the wind dared not stir. Willa's hand rested against Dakota's side, her palm steady on the bull's heaving ribs. The animal that had moments ago sent grown men fleeing now stood docile, snorting softly like a chastised child. Neighbors ringed the fence, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had seen men roped, dragged, and even gored by bulls. But never had they witnessed one tamed by nothing more than presence and voice. "Easy now," Willa murmured, her words low and deliberate. She didn't yank or push. She didn't fight Dakota into submission. Instead, she guided him slowly back toward the pasture, her boots sinking slightly into the churned earth. Each step carried a quiet authority, not born of fear but of trust. Emmett watched, torn between astonishment and something deeper, something like shame. He had lived with Dakota for years, feeding him, mending his fences, knowing the bull's temper and limits. Yet in a single morning, Willa had done what he never dared attempt. Mrs. Henderson, arms crossed tightly over her chest, sputtered, "Well, I'll be—" Her words trailed off as she glanced at her ruined garden. But even she could not disguise the grudging respect creeping across her face. A man from the crowd whispered, "That's not strength I've seen before." Another muttered, "That's something else." Later, scholars would call it animal psychology. Temple Grandin's early research in livestock handling proving that calm tones and low stress reduced aggression. But in that moment, the townsfolk had no name for what they witnessed. They only knew it felt like something between miracle and mastery. Willa pointed at the broken post with her free hand once Dakota was corralled. "Weak wood," she said matter-of-factly. "Replace it and he won't get out again." Her tone carried no drama, no gloating, just practical knowledge spoken as naturally as breathing. The neighbors, once smirking at the mismatched pair, now studied her with wary respect. Some even glanced at Emmett, as though reconsidering the man who had somehow drawn such a woman into his life. For Emmett, the moment carried a sharper weight. He had expected Willa to soften his loneliness, to fill the quiet of his evenings. Instead, she had walked straight into the center of chaos, unarmed, and shown the town and him that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it held steady when all else scattered, and Emmett could not help but wonder if perhaps the ranch and his life would never be the same. Quiet aftermath and new doubts. The yard was still again, though the churned soil and scattered stalks of Mrs. Henderson's garden bore witness to the storm that had just passed. Dakota, once a raging force of muscle and fury, grazed quietly within the pen as if nothing had happened. The neighbors, murmuring to one another, began to drift away. Some tipped their hats to Willa as they left, though their eyes still lingered on Emmett with an odd mix of pity and curiosity. Emmett stood near the barn, his jaw tight. He should have been the one to calm Dakota. He should have been the man the neighbors admired for courage, for control, for strength. Instead, he had frozen, rooted by fear, while Willa had stepped forward with unshaken calm. Each voice that carried down the road seemed to echo inside him. She handled him like he was a calf. Never seen a woman or a man do that before. What's Sloan worth next to that? The words gnawed at his pride. His whole life, Emmett had worked to prove himself, to carve out a ranch from stubborn land, to show he could stand among men in a place where brawn and grit set the measure. But in a single morning, Willa had outshone him before them all. That night, as the lantern flickered low inside the house, Emmett sat at the table with his hands clasped. His palms still bore the faint sting from gripping the fence rails too tightly, the physical memory of his own hesitation. Social scientists, centuries later, would call it social comparison theory, that gnawing tendency to measure one's worth against others, shrinking or swelling in the shadow of comparison. Emmett did not have words for it, but he felt its weight. Willa's presence magnified every insecurity he had kept hidden. Across the room, Willa unpacked her few belongings, a well-worn pair of gloves, a set of tools, a folded dress that had seen better days. She moved with quiet assurance, as if the day's chaos had not touched her nerves at all. When she glanced at him, Emmett looked away quickly, ashamed that he had been the one trembling while she stood firm. His loneliness, the very thing that had driven him to seek a bride, was not gone. It had only shifted, turned inward, into a doubt he had never known so sharply before. And in that quiet, Emmett Sloan wondered if he had brought into his home not a companion, but a mirror, one that revealed all the places he feared he might never measure up. Samuel Morrison's challenge. By the week's end, word of Willa's feat with Dakota had traveled farther than the dust from the stagecoach. Men at the saloon spoke of it between card games. Women mentioned it at the general store, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Some praised her courage, others clucked their tongues and said it wasn't natural. And then Samuel Morrison came. Morrison was a rancher with a chest like a barrel, and arms roped thick with muscle from decades of work. He was a man who believed the West had no patience for weakness, and he measured men by the weight they could lift and the cattle they could break. He arrived at Emmett's ranch one afternoon with his two sons, both broad-shouldered young men who carried themselves with their father's same smug assurance. Emmett spotted them riding in, his stomach tightening. Morrison had never been a friend, too quick to laugh at Emmett's slight frame, too quick to dismiss his modest spread. Today his eyes landed not on Emmett but on Willa. "Well now," Morrison drawled as he swung down from his horse, "the stories were true. A woman taller than most men and bold enough to walk a bull down by herself." His tone carried the edge of admiration, but beneath it lay a sharper note, challenge, even mockery. Emmett tried to answer, but Morrison pressed on, his gaze sweeping toward the barn. "Strong woman like that needs a strong man beside her. Question is, can you keep up, Sloan?" The words struck like a hammer. Emmett's throat tightened, shame rising again. But before he could stammer a reply, Willa stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but it cut through the afternoon air like the crack of a whip. "I don't need someone to keep up with me, Mr. Morrison. I need someone who walks beside me." His sons shifted uncomfortably, their smirks faltering. Morrison frowned, unused to being spoken to so directly. One of the boys offered almost eagerly, "Ma'am, if you ever need help lifting or carrying—" "I know my strength," Willa interrupted, her tone still polite but unyielding, "and I know when to ask." Today isn't that day. Silence followed. For the first time, Samuel Morrison had no quick retort. He tugged at his reins, muttering something about changing times before mounting his horse again. As they rode away, Emmett felt a strange mix of humiliation and relief. The confrontation had unsettled him, but it had also revealed something undeniable. Willa Blaine was not here to play a role the town expected. She was here to write her own. Porch reflections, broken expectations, honest hopes. That evening, after the Morrison clan had ridden away and the last of the neighbors' whispers faded into the prairie dusk, silence settled over the Sloan ranch. The only sounds were the distant chirp of crickets and the soft creak of the porch swing where Emmett and Willa now sat side by side. A lantern glowed faintly between them, its light swaying in rhythm with the night breeze. For a long time, neither spoke. Emmett's thoughts churned louder than the insects around them. Morrison's words echoed in his chest. Strong woman like that needs a strong man beside her. The weight of it pressed hard, mingling with his own doubts. Finally, Emmett broke the silence. His voice was low, brittle at the edges. I thought you'd be different. Smaller. Softer. Someone who'd make me feel more like the man I'm supposed to be. He forced the words out, ashamed to hear them aloud. Willa turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable in the lantern light. All my life, she said slowly, men have looked at me and seen a challenge. Something to conquer, or worse, something to mock. Rarely a partner. Never simply a woman who wants a place to belong. Her voice didn't rise, but the quiet force behind it was stronger than any accusation. Emmett shifted uncomfortably, feeling the sting of truth. He realized she carried her own loneliness. Different from his, but just as heavy. The porch creaked as she leaned back, staring into the stars. Do you know what I wanted when I answered your letter, Emmett? Not a man to prove himself bigger or stronger. Just someone honest. Someone who'd see me as more than my size. Her words stirred a memory. His own letter, months before, where he had written, "We'll make each other stronger, not smaller." Emmett's chest tightened. He had written those words with hope, yet here he was, shrinking before the very woman who might have been his answer. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, thick with unspoken truths and the fragile beginnings of understanding. And for the first time since she had stepped off the stage, Emmett felt that perhaps the woman beside him was not here to expose his weaknesses, but to remind him of a different kind of strength. The kind built not on comparison, but on shared burdens. The wooden ring, carved with patience. Several days passed in a rhythm of small labors, mending fences, feeding stock, tending the garden. Emmett worked beside Willa, still carrying his doubts, but watching her with new eyes. She moved with certainty, whether hoisting a bucket or calming a skittish calf. And yet there was no boast in her actions. She did what needed doing, no more, no less. On a quiet evening, after the chores were done and the prairie sky had darkened into velvet scattered with stars, Emmett disappeared into the house for a moment. When he returned, his hands were closed around something small, wrapped in a square of cloth. His palms trembled slightly as he held it out to her. I've been meaning to give you this, he said, his voice low. I started working on it long before you came. Willa raised a brow, curiosity softening her stern features. She took the bundle gently, unfolding the cloth to reveal a ring carved from wood. The grain was smooth, polished carefully, each curve shaped with patient precision. Tiny etchings circled its edge. Not fancy, but deliberate, signs of hours spent in quiet focus. I worked on it for 3 months, Emmett admitted, staring at the ground. Every evening after chores, thought maybe it would show I was serious, that I wasn't just looking for someone to keep the house or warm the bed. I wanted something that would last, something made with my hands. Willa slid the ring onto her finger, but it stopped halfway, too small for her hand. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Emmett's shoulders sagged, shame rushing in like floodwater. Doesn't even fit, he muttered. Should have known better. But Willa's laugh broke the tension, not mocking, but warm, almost tender. She held the ring up to the lantern light, studying the way it caught the glow. Emmett, she said softly, this isn't about fit. It's about care. A man who spends 3 months carving something beautiful when no one is watching is a man who sees beyond himself. Her words reached him deeper than she could have known. For years, his carefulness had been overlooked, even belittled. Yet here was a woman who saw it as strength. The ring might not have fit her finger, but in that moment, it fit her heart. Willa's conditions, shared learning, true equality. Willa turned the wooden ring in her hand, her thumb tracing the tiny etchings Emmett had so carefully carved. The lantern light made the polished grain glow like amber. For a long moment she said nothing, and Emmett's chest tightened with dread. He half expected her to set it aside, to thank him politely but dismiss the gesture as inadequate. Instead, she slipped it back onto her finger, though it rested awkwardly, caught at the knuckle. She looked at him with eyes that held both kindness and an iron steadiness. "Ask me again, Emmett," she said. He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. "Willa Blaine. Not because of letters, not because it's what people expect, but because I believe we can build something good together. Will you marry me?" A smile flickered across her lips. Not the smile of amusement, but of someone hearing something genuine at last. Still, she lifted her finger, the ring gleaming faintly. "On one condition," she said. Emmett's heart thudded. "Condition?" She nodded. "We resize this ring together. Not just the band, but what it represents. No man leading while the other follows. No woman shrinking herself to make the other taller. We learn from each other, share the burdens, trade skills. You'll teach me your woodworking, how patience makes shape out of raw material. And I'll teach you livestock, how to read an animal's body before it strikes, how to carry strength without cruelty." Her words cut through the air with a clarity that felt larger than the two of them, larger even than Dry Creek itself. They were not just making an agreement, they were rewriting the rules of what a marriage on the frontier could be. Emmett sat silent, her challenge settling over him like fresh snow. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, I'll teach you what I know, and I'll learn what you do, not as halves, as equals." For the first time since she'd stepped off the stage, the tension between them eased into something different. Not comfort yet, but possibility. The ring still didn't fit, but the promise it carried, the promise of shared work, shared learning, and shared respect, fit better than either of them could have imagined. And in the soft glow of that evening, Emmett realized he had not gained a wife who diminished him. He had gained a partner who demanded he grow. 6 months later, community witnesses change. 6 months slipped by, measured not in weeks, but in steady rhythms of work and change. The Sloan Ranch, once dismissed as modest, now thrived with a vigor that surprised even the neighbors who had once pitied Emmett. The fences stood solid, repaired with fresh posts that Willa had insisted they cut and set together. The barn doors no longer sagged, and the garden flourished with neat rows of beans and corn, thriving under Emmett's patient care and Willa's efficient hands. And then there was Dakota. The bull who had once terrorized the town now remained safely contained, his calves penned and manageable. It wasn't brute force that kept him in line, but Willa's uncanny understanding of his temperament, paired with Emmett's quiet diligence in reinforcing every weak spot in the fence. Together they balanced strength with foresight. When the day of their wedding arrived, the small church in Dry Creek filled with townsfolk. Curiosity hung in the air, mingled with a grudging respect. Many had come not just to witness vows, but to see whether this unlikely pair, so different in stature, so unconventional in union, could truly last. Willa entered not in lace or frills, but in a simple dress, her height no longer a spectacle, but a presence. Emmett stood at the front, shoulders straighter than before, a man no longer shrinking beneath whispers, but steady in his choice. When it came time to exchange rings, Emmett slid the resized wooden band onto Willa's finger. But there was more. Willa, with her own hands, had carved a matching band for him. The grain was different, the etchings her own, but the symbolism was clear. They had shaped something together, each leaving their mark on the other's token. Gasps rippled softly through the crowd. Even Samuel Morrison, sitting with his arms crossed, allowed himself a nod of approval. It was not just a marriage they were witnessing, but a declaration. Partnership could be more than tradition, more than strength overshadowing weakness. It could be two people reshaping the very ground they stood on. As the vows ended and the church bells rang, the whispers that had once mocked turned to quiet acceptance. For the first time, the town saw not the oddity of their pairing, but the strength of their bond. And Emmett and Willa, standing hand in hand, knew that what had begun in doubt had grown into something enduring, something neither had to carry alone. The frontier's quiet lesson, strength rewritten. The prairie has a way of keeping its own counsel. Seasons roll over the land without fanfare, and what survives is never the loudest, but the most enduring. So it was with Emmett and Willa Sloan. 6 months after their vows, neighbors who once whispered now nodded with respect when they passed in town. The Sloan ranch no longer looked modest. It looked whole, balanced. Emmett's careful hand could be seen in the straight rows of crops and the smooth polish of tools, while Willa's strength was etched into the sturdier fences and the calm order of the livestock. Each had left their mark, not by competing, but by weaving their gifts together. Emmett had grown in ways the townsfolk hadn't expected. He still wasn't the tallest nor the strongest, but his quiet presence carried weight. When he spoke, people listened, not because his voice boomed, but because it carried steadiness. Willa, too, had softened in ways unseen by strangers. Not weaker, never that, but less guarded, as though she had found at last a place where her size was not a burden but a gift freely given. The wooden rings they wore told the story best. Emmett's, carved with patience and detail, spoke of his careful love. Willa's, carved to match, spoke of her strength turned toward devotion. Together they symbolized something the frontier itself had yet to fully understand. That true partnership was not about who stood taller, but about who stood together. Some in Dry Creek would still cling to the old ways, to the notion that a man's worth lay in the width of his shoulders or the weight he could lift. But the story of Emmett and Willa spread in quieter circles, told at kitchen tables, whispered in church pews, and remembered by those who had seen with their own eyes a woman calm a raging bull with nothing but her voice. The frontier demanded resilience, but resilience came in many forms. Sometimes it was in calloused hands, sometimes in a heart patient enough to carve a ring for 3 months, and sometimes in a woman who refused to shrink so others could feel taller. Emmett and Willa Sloan had not simply survived together, they had rewritten what survival could mean. And in the hush of the prairie night, with stars scattered like fire across the dark, their lesson lingered. Strength was never meant to be a contest. It was meant to be shared.